My name is Chloe Harper. I'm 29, and last month I stood in a Boston funeral home and realized grief can be managed like a guest list. I was walking toward my father's casket when Gwen, his wife, shifted one step and blocked the aisle with her body. Her brother didn't even look at me. He just held up a hand. "Family first," he said, like it was policy. Gwen's face stayed smooth, almost polite. "This is for immediate family," she added, as if I'd wandered into the wrong room. A week later, she did it again at the will reading. She smiled and said, "Only heirs named in the will." I didn't argue. I just set my tote on the table and reached for the file she didn't know I had. She thought she was closing the door. She didn't realize she was opening something else. Before I go on, let me say this. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the family calm, you already know this feeling. Tell me where you're listening from, just the city or state. I didn't grow up thinking about wills or inheritances. I grew up thinking about Sunday mornings. After my mum, Maria, died when I was 15, it was just me and my dad, Ethan. The house didn't change much after that. Same creaky steps, same chipped mug by the sink, same old clock in the hallway that ticked too loud at night. What changed was the quiet. It settled in like dust. Some days we talked around it. Some days we let it sit. Dad handled grief the way he handled everything else, by showing up. He made dinner. He paid the bills. He drove me to school when I missed the bus. Late at night, when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him rinsing dishes over and over. Like if he kept his hands busy long enough, the rest of it wouldn't catch up to him. On Sundays, we escaped. If the weather cooperated, we'd take his small boat out into the harbour. Nothing fancy, just wind, water, and the sound of the sails snapping open. Afterward, we'd get brunch at the same place we'd been going since I was a kid. Vinyl booths, coffee that tasted burnt no matter how much cream you added. We'd sit there longer than necessary, talking about nothing important, school, work, the Red Sox. Those mornings felt safe, like proof that we were still a family, even if it looked smaller than before. Dad believed in dignity. He didn't say the word often, but he lived it. Pay your debts, keep your word, don't take what isn't yours, and don't beg for what should already be given. When I went to college, he offered to pay for everything: tuition, rent, food. I said no, not because I didn't need the help, but because I needed to know I could stand on my own. He shook his head and smiled. "You're stubborn," he said, "just like your mother." I worked through school, took out modest loans, learned how to budget down to the dollar. When I graduated and got a job in Seattle, the distance hurt more than I expected. We talked every day anyway. Short calls, sometimes long ones. Sometimes just silence on the line while we both did our own thing. That was enough. Gwen entered our lives quietly, and then, all at once. Dad met her at a charity event. She was polished in a way that made you feel underdressed, no matter what you wore. Warm voice, perfect timing with her smiles. She asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments. When Dad told me about her, he sounded lighter, happier. I wanted that for him. After years of grief, he deserved someone who made him feel less alone. She came with 2 kids, Colt and Sadie. They were polite the first time we met. Too polite. Colt's eyes moved around the house like he was inventorying it. Sadie hugged Dad a little too tightly, like she was already staking a claim. I told myself I was being unfair. They'd had their own losses, their own story. The wedding happened 6 months later. Fast, but not unheard of. I stood next to Dad, smiling for photos, while Gwen talked about honesty and family. The words sounded right. Something about the way she said them didn't. After they moved in, the house shifted in small ways. Photos of my mum disappeared from the walls. Not all at once. One here, one there. When I asked, Gwen said she was redecorating, making the space feel fresh. Dad didn't argue. He just looked tired. Sunday mornings started filling up with other plans. Dinners with Gwen's friends, Colt's commitments, family obligations that somehow never included me. When Dad and I did manage time alone, Gwen would call. Once, twice, 8 times. Emergencies that weren't emergencies. Keys she couldn't find. Appointments she'd forgotten. Dad always went back early. I told myself it was normal. Adjustment takes time. Blended families are complicated. That's what people say when they don't want to name what's really happening. The first time I felt something sink in my chest was the night I noticed my mum's photo missing from Dad's bedside table. Gwen said she was dusting. Dad didn't meet my eyes. I laughed it off. But later, alone in the guest room, I couldn't sleep. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the first time something essential shifted. And it wasn't just about a picture. After that, I started noticing patterns instead of moments. Colt treated the house like it had always belonged to him. He parked in my dad's spot, left his things wherever he felt like it. Once, he joked about renovating the kitchen when, "This is all ours someday." He said it casually, like a fact everyone else already accepted. Gwen laughed. Dad didn't. Sadie was different. She cried easily. I needed reassurance constantly. She called Dad bonus dad in this soft, practiced voice that made people smile. When I was around, she'd cling to Gwen's arm and look at me like she was afraid I might disappear. Gwen always noticed, always stepped in, always chose her. I tried to stay out of it. I lived in Seattle. I had a job, a life. I didn't want to be the adult child who hovered and complained. But every time I visited, Dad seemed smaller, slower. He forgot details he never used to forget. He repeated stories. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence and just stare, like the thought had slipped out of reach. Gwen handled his medication. She liked to point that out. "It's complicated," she'd say, lining up pill bottles on the counter. "You wouldn't want to get it wrong." The pills changed often, colours I didn't recognise, labels that looked new. When I asked his doctor questions, Gwen answered for him. Dad let her. One afternoon, while Gwen was out, Dad asked me to sit with him in his study. He closed the door, which felt strange all by itself. He took my hand, his grip tighter than I expected. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly, "I need you to talk to Nora." He paused, catching his breath. "She has something important." Before I could ask more, Gwen's footsteps were in the hallway. The door opened. The moment ended. After that, my calls went through Gwen more often than Dad. She always said he was resting, or napping, or having a bad day. When I did speak to him, his words were slow, slurred sometimes. I told myself it was stressful, age, heart problems, anything but what my gut was whispering. Then came the call. Colt's voice, flat. "Your dad's in the hospital." No details, no comfort, just an address and a hang-up. I was on the first flight back to Boston. 5 hours in a cramped seat, staring at the seat back, replaying every conversation I'd ignored. At the hospital, Gwen stood between me and the hallway like a wall. "He needs rest," she said. "No visitors." When I insisted, she leaned closer. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The nurse told me Gwen had reported that his only children were already present. That sentence landed harder than anything else that day. I waited for hours. I watched them go in and out of his room while I stayed in a plastic chair by the vending machines. When a doctor finally agreed to let me see him, Gwen pulled him aside. They talked quietly. When he came back, his tone had changed. "As a medical proxy, we have to respect her wishes." Security walked me out. 3 days later, a nurse found me in the cafeteria. She sat down without asking. "Your dad's been asking for you," she whispered. "He's not in a coma." We planned a visit for that night. 11 p.m., quiet shift. I didn't sleep. I counted minutes. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. He was gone. The funeral was worse. Gwen arranged everything. Expensive, impersonal. I was seated in the back. During the eulogy, she spoke about family without saying my name once. When it was time to say goodbye, her brother stepped in front of me. "Family first," he said. The casket closed. Driving back to my hotel, I felt hollow, like I'd lost my father twice, once to death, once to the people who decided I didn't belong anymore. That night, I thought it was over. I thought whatever came next would just hurt quietly. I had no idea my dad had already planned for what Gwen would do after he was gone. The days after the funeral blurred together, but the tension sharpened. I stayed in Boston longer than I planned. I told my manager I needed more time. She didn't ask questions. Grief is one of the few things people still respect without explanations. I moved from one hotel to another, partly because I couldn't bring myself to go home, partly because I didn't want Gwen to know where I was staying. On the third morning, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was to stay silent and let it pass. The knock came again, softer this time. When I opened the door, Nora Ellison stood in the hallway, her coat still on, her eyes already scanning behind me like she was afraid of being seen. "May I come in?" she asked. Nora had worked for my dad for 15 years. She knew his schedules, his moods, the way he liked his coffee. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without needing reminders. Seeing her there knocked the air out of me. She didn't sit down right away. She set her purse on the table and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with red wax. My father's signet ring was pressed into it. I recognized it immediately. He'd worn it every day. "He gave this to me 6 months ago," Nora said. "He made me promise I would only hand it to you. In person. If anything happened to him." My hands shook when I took it. "Did he say what it was?" She shook her head. "Only that you'd know what to do, and that Gwen couldn't know about it." Before I could ask anything else, Nora checked her watch. "I should go. Gwen's been at the office every day since the funeral, going through files. She fired 2 people already." When the door closed behind her, the room felt too quiet. I stared at the envelope for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from my dad, a sealed legal document with a law firm name I didn't recognize, and a small key taped to an index card with a bank address and a box number written in his careful handwriting. I read his letter twice, then a third time. He wrote about mistakes, about trust, about noticing things disappearing, about medications that made him feel worse instead of better. He wrote that he'd updated his will with a new firm and filed it with the state. He wrote that Gwen didn't know. At the bottom he wrote, "I love you. Always trust your gut." I didn't cry. I felt steady, focused, like something heavy had finally landed where it belonged. The next morning I went to the bank. Mr. Whitman, the branch manager, verified my ID and the key. He walked me past thick doors into the vault and left me alone with the box. Inside were documents my dad had carefully organized, bank statements showing transfers I didn't recognize, photos taken by a private investigator. Gwen met a man my dad identified as her ex, though the notes suggested the story wasn't that simple. Copies of medical records with my dad's handwriting in the margins. Questions, dates, doubts. There was a flash drive too, audio files, conversations recorded in my dad's home office, Gwen's voice, Colt's voice, talking about after he's gone, talking about money, about timing, about pills. I closed the box and locked it with hands that didn't feel like mine. That afternoon, I got a text from Colt. "Go back to Seattle." No punctuation, no context, just a warning. That night, my hotel room was searched. Nothing broken, just moved. The folder with copies of the medical records was gone. I still had the originals. I'd learned enough from my dad to never keep everything in one place. The next morning, Sadie texted me. She wanted to talk. Just us, coffee. When she sat down, she couldn't see my eyes. She cried, apologized without saying for what. Then she said, "Mom said the pills make him easier." I didn't respond. I just listened. By the time I walked away from that table, I knew 2 things for certain. Gwen believed she was in control, and she believed I was alone. She was wrong about both. After that, everything moved faster, even when I stayed still. I met with Frank Delaney 2 days later. He'd been my father's attorney for nearly 3 decades before Gwen replaced him without explanation. His office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, the same smell I remembered from childhood visits, when Dad would bring me along and tell me to wait quietly in the chair by the window. Frank didn't interrupt while I talked. He didn't soften his face either. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Your father was worried. Not dramatic, not angry, just factual. He called me 7 months ago. Asked how to update his will without his wife knowing. That alone tells me something. He explained the basics: probate timelines, contesting a will, undue influence, medical proxies. He told me what mattered and what didn't. Paper trails matter, he said. Feelings don't. I nodded. That sounded like my dad. When I left his office, I felt watched. It wasn't obvious. No one followed me down the street. No black SUV idling nearby. Just small things. A car parked too close when I came out of a grocery store. A man in a maintenance uniform near my hotel room who didn't look up when I passed. I changed hotels again, used my middle name at check-in. Gwen didn't call. That worried me more than if she had. Instead, I heard from people who never used to reach out. Old friends of my father's, a woman from his sailing club, one of his former business partners. They all said versions of the same thing. Gwen was telling people I'd abandoned him, that I'd swooped in at the end, that I was unstable, greedy, confused. I let it spread. Every lie she told made her more comfortable, more careless. The day before the reading, Frank called me. "You're not listed as an attendee," he said. "Gwen's attorney requested a private reading. He can't legally bar you from being present, but they're going to try." "I'll be there," I said. That night I laid everything out on the bed: the sealed will, copies of bank transfers, transcripts of the audio recordings, my dad's handwritten timeline. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I sorted, labelled, made backups, uploaded encrypted copies, put the originals back into the envelope and the box where they belonged. I slept for 3 hours. That was enough. The next afternoon, I walked into the law office wearing the same black coat I'd worn to the funeral. My tote felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the weight, but because of what it represented. The receptionist looked startled when I gave my name. "You're not scheduled," she said, already reaching for the phone. "I know," I said. "I'm still here to listen." Lance Mercer came out a moment later. He was polite, uncomfortable. "Mrs. Harper believes you're aware you're not included," he said, like he was reciting a message he didn't fully agree with. "I'm Ethan Harper's daughter," I said. "I'll sit quietly." When I entered the conference room, Gwen's face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: surprise, annoyance, control. Colt stared at me like I'd walked into the wrong house. Sadie clutched her purse, already preparing to cry. "This meeting is only for heirs named in the will," Gwen said calmly. "Robert was very clear." I took a seat anyway. The reading began. Lance's voice was steady as he listed properties, accounts, percentages, names, Gwen's name, Colt's, Sadie's, over and over again. My name appeared only once, buried in a clause that offered a few personal items, nothing more. Gwen looked at me then, not with pity, with satisfaction. I let the silence stretch. Then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I reached into my tote and placed the sealed file on the table in front of Lance Mercer. "I believe there's a more recent document," I said. "You should read that." Gwen laughed once, sharp. "That's absurd!" Lance picked up the file anyway. When he broke the seal, the room changed. Lance didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the first page, then the second. His shoulders tightened, almost imperceptibly, the way people do when they realize the ground under them isn't where they thought it was. "This document," he said slowly, "is dated 6 months after the will we're reviewing." Gwen leaned forward. "That's not possible. Robert would have told me." Lance kept reading. He turned another page, then another. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner kick on and off, like it was breathing for us. Colt shifted in his chair. Sadie stopped crying. No one looked at me. "It appears," Lance said, choosing each word carefully, "that Mr. Harper executed a subsequent will with a different firm. This document contains language that explicitly revokes all prior wills and codicils." Gwen stood up. "This is a forgery." Lance glanced at the notary seal, the witness signatures, the filing confirmation from the state. "The execution appears valid. The firm listed here is reputable, and the filing number indicates it was registered. He cleared his throat and continued reading. The terms were different, completely. Gwen and her children weren't cut off. They were placed into a trust, an allowance, controlled, no access to the principal, no ability to move money around on their own. Colt's jaw clenched. Sadie looked confused, like she hadn't rehearsed this part. Then came the house. The primary residence is to be partially liquidated, Lance read, with proceeds used to establish the Maria Harper Foundation. Gwen's head snapped toward me. What? The foundation was named for my mother. It was my dad's idea of balance, of repair. The rest of the estate, his company, the controlling interest, was left to me, with instructions. Ethical development, charitable oversight, no quick flips, no stripping assets for cash. Gwen's face had gone pale, not angry, calculating. Lance paused before the final section. There is an additional clause. I felt my hands tighten on the back of the chair. I already knew what it said. I'd read it enough times to memorize the commas. In the event that my death occurs under circumstances that may be considered premature or suspicious, Lance read, I direct my executor to authorize a full review of my medical treatment, medication records, and any related decisions made under medical proxy. The silence this time was heavier. Colt looked at his mother, really looked at her. Sadie's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Gwen didn't speak. She didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Lance. This is insane, she finally said. He was confused. He wasn't well. Lance set the papers down. If you intend to contest this will, Mrs. Harper, it will require a formal probate process. I will contest it, Gwen said sharply. This meeting is over. She reached for her bag. Her hands were shaking now. Colt stood up with her. Sadie followed, silent. As they left the room, Gwen stopped just long enough to look at me. This isn't finished, she said. I know, I replied. My voice didn't change. After the door closed, Lance exhaled. Miss Harper, he said, I need to disclose that I had no knowledge of this document. I understand, I said, and I did. I gathered my things. The tote felt lighter than it had when I walked in. Not because I'd won anything, but because the truth was finally in the open. They had walked into that room thinking the story was over, that the paperwork was settled, that I'd been erased. They were wrong. I stepped into the hallway knowing my father had done the one thing he always promised. He showed up, even after he was gone. I didn't feel relieved when I left the building. I felt alert. That night I met with Frank again. Different tone this time, less sympathy, more strategy. We talked about freezing assets, removing Gwen as executor, filing for a temporary restraining order, not as punishment, as containment. He explained how quickly money can disappear when someone feels cornered. I listened, took notes, asked questions my dad would have asked. The next morning, I got my first voicemail from Gwen's brother. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. He talked about keeping things in the family and not dragging this out. I saved it, labelled it, backed it up. By the end of the week, the rumours shifted. Gwen wasn't confident anymore. She was angry. She told people I'd manipulated my father, that I'd taken advantage of his grief, that I'd poisoned him against her. The word landed wrong when she said it, too specific, too rehearsed. I didn't correct her. I filed emergency motions. Frank moved fast. Accounts were flagged. Transfers paused. Gwen was notified that her authority as medical proxy was under review. She responded with silence, then with noise. Texts, emails, accusations. I didn't answer. Detective O'Connor called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't say much, just that he'd reviewed the clause in the will, just that the medication list didn't match the chart, just that he had questions. When I hung up, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel until my hands stopped shaking. This wasn't about money anymore. It hadn't been for a while. They thought cutting me out would make me go away, that I'd fold quietly and disappear back to Seattle. What they actually did was remove the last reason I had to protect them. They buried the truth in paperwork. Unfortunately for them, I read every line, and I wasn't done yet. The first quiet moment came weeks later, not days. I was sitting alone at a small kitchen table in a short-term rental, staring at a cup of coffee I'd reheated twice and still hadn't touched. My shoulders ached in that dull, familiar way that comes from holding yourself together for too long. Winning, if that's what it was, didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing after a long fall and realizing you're still going to limp. When I returned to my father's house for the first time after everything paused, it didn't feel like coming home. It felt like entering a place I used to know. The rooms were quiet, too quiet. The HVAC hummed the way it always had, but without him there, the sound felt exposed. Light came through the blinds in narrow stripes, catching dust that had been disturbed and resettled. I moved slowly, like I was afraid the house might reject me. In his study, I found a drawer Gwen hadn't opened, or maybe she had and decided it wasn't worth her time. Inside was a small stack of index cards tied with twine, my dad's handwriting, notes he'd made for himself, sailing dates, book quotes, a reminder to call me on my birthday. I sat on the floor and held those cards in my lap. He protected the memory. He just couldn't protect me when it mattered. That truth hurts in a quiet, adult way. Nora came by later that afternoon. She apologized, but it came out stiff and late, like she'd practiced it alone. I didn't rush to comfort her. I told her I appreciated her showing up now. That was enough. Boundaries don't have to be cruel to be firm. Healing didn't look dramatic. It looked domestic. I changed the locks. I cleared one drawer at a time. I put my mother's photo back on the wall, exactly where it used to hang. I left my father's desk untouched. Some spaces don't need to be reclaimed. They just need to be respected. I would trade the house, the money, all of it, for one moment where my father chose me out loud while he was still alive. But I don't get to rewrite his choices. I only get to decide what I accept now. A week later, a letter arrived from the bank. Routine language, an unfamiliar account number. I folded it carefully and set it aside. There were still things unfolding, still truths moving toward the surface. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was paying attention. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story probably hit close to home. This was never just about money. It was about what people do when they think you won't fight back. If you want to hear how this ends, subscribe. Share this with someone who's been burned by family decisions. And tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were me. I read every one. Your story might be the next one I tell. End of.